Jonathan Adams had it all. A billion-dollar tech empire, a penthouse that scraped the clouds, and a wife, Lillian, whose quiet grace was the envy of their social circle. But ambition is a hungry beast. He threw it all away for a firestorm of passion with his brilliant, ruthless protégé, Maureen Carter. The night he told Lillian he was leaving, he never imagined the secret she held, a new life growing inside her. He walked away, convincing himself it was a clean break, a necessary sacrifice for a more thrilling future. Months later, haunted by a silence he couldn't explain, he would find himself standing in the doorway of her new, humble life, his heart stopping as he saw her motionless on the sofa. In that single, terrifying moment, the millionaire who had everything realized he had truly lost it all. The click of the penthouse door was a sound Lillian Brooks had learned to interpret. There was the 10 p.m. click, tired but triumphant, when a deal was closed. There was the 1 a.m. click, heavy with exhaustion and the faint scent of whiskey after a board meeting had gone south. Tonight's 8:30 p.m. click was different. It was hesitant, almost guilty. Jonathan Adams shrugged off his custom-tailored jacket, the fabric whispering of wealth he'd earned with relentless, single-minded focus. He loosened his silk tie, his movements mechanical. "Long day," he murmured, not quite meeting her eyes as he walked past her, toward the sprawling, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's glittering expanse. "I kept dinner warm," Lillian said softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the city's hum. She'd made his favorite, osso buco, a slow braised dish that had taken her all afternoon. The aroma filled their cavernous, minimalist home, a space designed by a famous architect to be impressive, not comfortable. It felt like living in a museum. "Not hungry," he said, his back still to her. Lillian's heart did a familiar, painful squeeze. For months, it had been like this. He was a ghost in their own home, physically present, but emotionally a million miles away. He'd built his company, Nexus Innovations, from a garage startup into a global behemoth. But the man she married, the passionate, driven dreamer who'd sketch ideas on napkins, had been replaced by this cold, distant CEO. She'd given up her own promising career as an art curator to support his dream, a choice she'd made with an open heart. Now she felt like just another one of his assets, polished and maintained, but rarely appreciated. She smoothed a hand over her stomach, a nervous habit she'd developed recently. She had a secret, a fragile, beautiful hope she believed could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. She just needed the right moment. The right moment, Lillian decided, would be Saturday. Jonathan had promised, a rare, solid promise, that they would have the entire day to themselves. No calls, no emails, no emergencies. Just them. On Friday morning, after he'd left for the office in a chauffeured town car, Lillian stood in the marble-clad bathroom, her heart thundering against her ribs. She stared at the small plastic stick on the counter. 2 pink lines, bold, clear, and undeniable. A sob of pure joy escaped her lips. Tears streamed down her face, but these were happy tears, the kind she hadn't shed in years. A baby. Their baby. This was it. This was the anchor they needed, the miracle that would remind Jonathan of the life they had sworn to build together. It would be more than just Nexus Innovations and stock prices. It would be a family. She spent the entire day in a giddy haze. She bought a tiny pair of white booties and a small, elegant gift box. She planned a perfect evening, a simple, home-cooked meal, their favorite music, and then she would give him the box. She imagined his surprise, the flicker of shock in his deep blue eyes, giving way to a slow, brilliant smile. The real smile she missed so dearly. She pictured him wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight, his hand resting protectively over the new life she carried. This wouldn't just fix things, it would remake them. It would bring him home. For good. Saturday arrived, but Jonathan was late. An hour passed, then 2. Lillian's carefully prepared risotto grew cold on the stove. The candles she'd lit began to melt into puddles of wax. The hopeful energy in the apartment slowly fizzled into the familiar ache of disappointment. When he finally walked in, close to 10 p.m., he looked haggard. But there was something else in his eyes, too. A strange resolve that made her stomach clench with a fear that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. "John, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice small. He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the bar and poured himself a scotch, his hand shaking slightly. He downed it in one go before turning to face her. The look on his face was one she'd never seen before, a chilling mixture of pity and finality. "Lillian, we need to talk," he began, the words a cliché that landed like a punch. "I haven't been fair to you. For a long time now." She stood frozen, the little gift box feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath. "I'm in love with someone else." The words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Lillian felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. "What?" she whispered. "Her name is Maureen Carter," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing a business merger. "She's the head of my R&D department. She understands my world. She understands me. We've been seeing each other for 6 months. 6 months. A timeline of deceit overlaid itself onto her memories. The late nights, the business trips, the emotional distance. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "No," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, Jonathan, you can't." "I'm sorry, Lillian. I truly am. But I can't live a lie anymore," he said, his voice firming up, any flicker of regret extinguished by his decision. "I want a divorce." The word divorce shattered the last of her composure. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto one of the ridiculously expensive, uncomfortable sofas. The small gift box fell from her lap, landing on the plush rug with a soft thud. Jonathan's eyes flickered down to it, but his expression remained unchanged. "A divorce?" she echoed, her voice cracking. "Jonathan, we built this life together. I gave up everything for you." "I know," he said, and the placid acknowledgement was somehow worse than an argument. "And I'll make sure you're taken care of. You'll be very comfortable. My lawyer will be in touch." He spoke of their marriage, their shared history, as if it were a severance package. The coldness of it was a physical blow, a desperate, primal need to make him see, to make him understand what he was throwing away, surged through her. "You don't understand," she sobbed, her hands instinctively going to her stomach. "You can't do this. Not now." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Jonathan, I'm pregnant." For the first time, his mask of control cracked. Shock widened his eyes. "What?" "I'm pregnant," she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I was going to tell you tonight. That's what's in the box." He stared at her, then at her stomach, and a dark, ugly suspicion twisted his features. "Pregnant? You're telling me this now?" He let out a short, incredulous laugh that held no humor. "Lillian, is this some kind of game? Are you trying to trap me?" The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth, that it knocked the breath from her lungs. He didn't see a miracle. He saw a tactic. He didn't see their child. He saw a chain. The love she thought was buried deep within him wasn't just buried. It was gone. In its place was this cruel, suspicious stranger. "It changes nothing," he said, his voice like ice. He was rebuilding his walls, reinforcing his decision. It's better this way. I won't bring a child into a loveless home. He turned and walked toward the door, not even glancing back at the tiny gift box on the floor, the symbol of their shattered future. The door clicked shut behind him, and this time, Lillian knew what it meant. It was the final click, the end of everything. Alone in the cavernous silence, she let out a raw, wounded cry that was swallowed by the indifferent luxury of the home that was no longer hers. The days that followed were a blur of grey. The penthouse, once a symbol of success, became a prison of memories. Every corner held a ghost of the life she thought she had. The expensive art on the walls, pieces she had lovingly curated, now seemed to mock her. Jonathan was gone. He'd sent a courier for his essential belongings, a sterile and impersonal transaction that underscored his departure. His lawyer, a woman with a sympathetic but firm demeanor, had been in touch. The divorce papers were being drafted. Lillian felt herself adrift in a sea of grief and shock. For 2 days, she barely moved from the sofa, the same spot where her world had imploded. Then, a key turned in the lock. It wasn't Jonathan. It was Chloe, her best friend, her face etched with worry. "Lil, your phone's been off. I was so scared," Chloe said, rushing to her side and wrapping her in a fierce hug. The simple act of human contact broke the dam. Lillian collapsed into her friend's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She poured out the whole sordid story, the affair, the cold confession, the cruel accusation. Chloe listened, her expression hardening with fury at Jonathan. "That absolute bastard," Chloe seethed. "To do that to you. And now, when you're pregnant—" She held Lillian at arm's length. "Okay, that's it. Operation Phoenix begins now. We are rising from these designer ashes." Chloe's pragmatic energy was the lifeline Lillian needed. First, she made Lillian eat. Then, she helped her pack. Not everything, just the things that mattered. Her books, her personal art, photos of her family, the few sentimental items that predated Jonathan. They left the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the soulless furniture. "You don't need any of this," Chloe stated, gesturing around the opulent apartment. "This is his cage, not your home." With Chloe's help, Lillian found a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood miles away from the heartless glitter of downtown. It was modest, with old hardwood floors and big windows that let in the afternoon sun. It was the kind of place she could have afforded on her old curator's salary. It felt real. As she signed the lease, using the emergency savings she'd always kept separate, she felt the first flicker of agency she'd had in a decade. She was terrified, but she was no longer just a victim of Jonathan's choices. She was making her own. The day she moved out of the penthouse for good, she didn't look back. Jonathan Adams dove headfirst into his new life with Maureen Carter, treating it like a corporate takeover. He moved her into a sleek, modern condo, even more audacious than the one he'd shared with Lillian. It was all glass and steel, a testament to a future unburdened by the past. He bought her extravagant gifts, a rare diamond necklace, a cherry-red sports car, a weekend trip to Paris on a private jet. The business journals and gossip columns lapped it up, painting him as a titan of industry, with a love life as bold as his business ventures. Maureen was everything Lillian wasn't. She was fierce, ambitious, and utterly consumed by the world of power and success they now shared. Their conversations were about market disruption and quarterly earnings. Their passion was a volatile, high-stakes game that mirrored the boardroom. In the beginning, it was intoxicating. It was the validation he craved. He had chosen fire over comfort, ambition over obligation. He told himself he was happy, but guilt is a persistent ghost. It would find him in the quiet moments. He'd be in a meeting, and an image of Lillian's devastated face would flash in his mind. He'd wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, the echo of her whispered words, "I'm pregnant," reverberating in the sterile darkness of his new bedroom. He'd push the thoughts away, burying them under more work, more champagne, more of Morin's consuming presence. He was running from a memory, but the faster he ran, the more it seemed to pursue him. Miles away, Lillian was building a different kind of life. Her small apartment was slowly becoming a home. She unpacked her books, hung her favorite prints, and bought a comfortable rocking chair for the second bedroom, which she was turning into a nursery. The first few weeks were brutally hard. Morning sickness was relentless, and the loneliness at night was a physical weight. Her savings were dwindling faster than she'd anticipated. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She reached out to a contact at a small, independent art gallery. The owner, a kind, older woman named Eleanor, remembered Lillian's sharp eye and reputation. She couldn't offer a full-time curator position, but she hired her as a part-time consultant, helping to source and appraise pieces from emerging artists. The work was a balm for her soul. It reconnected her to a part of herself she thought was lost forever. Walking through the quiet gallery, discussing the nuance of brush strokes and color palettes, she felt a sense of purpose return. She started attending prenatal yoga classes where she met other expectant mothers. They talked about cravings and fears, stretch marks and strollers. In their shared experience, she found a quiet community. She was no longer just Jonathan Adams's discarded wife. She was Lillian Brooks, an art consultant, a mother-to-be. She was struggling and she was scared, but with every passing day, a quiet, resilient strength grew within her, solid and real. It was a strength forged in heartbreak, and it was entirely her own. The gloss of Jonathan and Morin's romance began to wear thin. Morin, having secured her place by his side, started to push for more. She wanted the ultimate merger. Marriage. "When are you going to put a ring on my finger, John?" she'd ask, half joking but with a sharp, serious edge. "The divorce isn't even finalized. People are talking. It's being handled," he'd say dismissively, but her words pricked at his unease. Morin grew increasingly possessive. She resented any mention of his past, however indirect. Once, he'd absently picked up a baby sweater in a department store window, his thoughts drifting. Morin had yanked his arm away. "What are you looking at that for? Don't tell me you're actually thinking about it." The baby was the unspoken wedge between them. To Morin, the unborn child was a loose end, a permanent, living link to the woman she had displaced. She saw it as a threat to her claim on him. To Jonathan, the baby was a growing knot of guilt in his gut. He tried to compartmentalize it, to treat it as a financial obligation to be managed by his lawyers, but it wasn't working. Their arguments became more frequent. The thrilling fire of their affair was becoming a draining, consuming blaze. He started to see a desperate insecurity beneath Morin's confident exterior. She hadn't just wanted him, she wanted his life, his status, his power. And she was terrified that the ghost of his past and the reality of his future child could take it all away. The realization was unsettling. He had blown up his life for a passion that was starting to feel as hollow as the penthouse he'd abandoned. It had been 3 months, 3 months of court-mandated silence as the lawyers hashed out the financials of the divorce. He had agreed to a generous settlement, a guilt tax, he'd called it privately. But he hadn't spoken a single word to Lillian. He had no idea how she was, where she was living, or what she was doing. He only knew she hadn't contested the divorce. The not knowing began to eat at him. Was she okay? Was the baby okay? He tried to rationalize his distance. She needs space. Contact would only hurt her more. But he knew it was a coward's excuse. He was afraid to face her, afraid of the judgment in her eyes, afraid of the man she would see when she looked at him. One night, he was alone. Maureen was at a tech gala he couldn't bring himself to attend. He sat in his sterile condo, the silence pressing in on him. He pulled out his phone and stared at Lillian's contact name. His finger hovered over the call button. He thought of her collapse into the sofa, of the cruel things he'd said. "Are you trying to trap me?" The memory made his stomach churn with self-loathing. What kind of man was he? He had built an empire on predicting outcomes and managing risk, yet he had been utterly, catastrophically blind to the human cost of his actions. He was going to be a father who had abandoned his child's mother in her moment of greatest vulnerability. The thought was unbearable. His conscience, long suppressed by ambition and denial, screamed at him. He had to know if she was all right. He had to do something. With a trembling finger, Jonathan pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4, before going to voicemail. Lillian's voice, calm, professional, the one she used for her old gallery work, filled his ear. "You've reached Lillian Brooks. Please leave a message." He hung up without saying anything, a wave of cold dread washing over him. She didn't pick up. Of course, she didn't. Why would she want to talk to him? He tried to tell himself it was nothing. She was probably busy, or sleeping. He waited an hour, pacing the length of his condo, the city lights below seeming to mock his agitation. He called again. Straight to voicemail. Panic, sharp and acidic, began to rise in his throat. This wasn't right. Even if she hated him, Lillian was polite. She would have at least sent a text telling him to leave her alone. The silence felt wrong. It felt dangerous. He called his lawyer. "I need Lillian's address," he said, his voice tight. "Jonathan, I don't think that's a good idea," the lawyer advised, her voice cautious. "The terms of the separation." "I don't care about the terms," he snapped. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. Just send me the address. Now." A minute later, a text message pinged with a street name and apartment number in a part of the city he hadn't been to in years. He grabbed his car keys, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't know what he was expecting to find. He just knew he had to go. As he sped through the city streets, leaving his new life in the rear-view mirror, he was consumed by a single, terrifying thought. What if he was too late? The apartment building was a modest, 3-story brick structure, a world away from the gleaming towers he was used to. He found her unit on the 2nd floor. He stood before the plain wooden door, his hand raised to knock, but he hesitated. What right did he have to be here? He took a deep breath and knocked lightly. "Lillian?" No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Lillian, it's Jonathan. Please just let me know you're okay." Silence. The dread in his gut intensified into full-blown terror. He tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through him. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was small but tidy. Sunlight streamed through a large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was filled with her things, her books, her art, a half-finished baby blanket, and knitting needles resting in a basket. A wave of vertigo hit him as he took it all in. This was her life now, a life he had forced upon her. "Lillian," he called out, his voice hoarse. He walked past the small kitchen and into the living room. And then he saw her. She was on the sofa, half lying, half slumped, her head lolling at an unnatural angle. Her skin was waxy and pale, with a bluish tint to her lips. Her hand was resting on her stomach, where a pronounced, unmistakable baby bump was visible beneath her simple cotton dress. For a moment, his brain couldn't process the scene. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and broken. "Lil?" he whispered, rushing to her side. He touched her arm. It was cold. "Lillian!" He shook her shoulder gently. No response. Her breathing was shallow, barely perceptible. His blood ran cold. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and shaking so violently he could barely press the numbers. 911, what is your emergency? My wife, he stammered, the word feeling alien and fraudulent on his tongue. She's collapsed. She's pregnant. She's not responding. I'm at... He rattled off the address, his voice cracking with a terror so profound it felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside. In that moment, standing over the motionless body of the woman he had so callously discarded, Jonathan Adams, the billionaire titan, was utterly, devastatingly broken. The wail of the ambulance siren was a sound Jonathan would never forget. He followed it to the hospital in a daze, the short drive feeling like an eternity. He was relegated to the waiting room, a sterile beige box where time seemed to warp and stretch. Nurses and doctors bustled past, their faces grimly professional, ignoring the frantic, disheveled man in the expensive suit. He was no longer a CEO. He was just another terrified person waiting for news. Hours crawled by. He replayed the scene in her apartment over and over in his mind. Her pale face, the unnatural stillness, the curve of her belly. He had done this. His cruelty, his neglect, it had led to this. The empire he built felt like a pile of ashes. The thrill of his affair with Moran seemed like a sick, childish fantasy. Finally, a doctor with tired eyes and a kind face approached him. "Mr. Adams?" Jonathan shot to his feet. "Is she okay? The baby?" "Your wife is stable for now," the doctor began, his tone cautious. "She was suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition, but the more serious issue is preeclampsia. Her blood pressure is dangerously high. It's a serious complication of pregnancy, often exacerbated by extreme stress." The doctor's gaze was pointed, and Jonathan felt the unspoken accusation like a physical blow. "We've managed to stabilize her, but she and the baby are both in a high-risk situation. We'll be monitoring them very closely. The next 24 hours are critical." Jonathan sagged back into his chair. The relief that she was alive immediately swamped by the fear of what could still happen. He had almost lost them both. Because of him. He was powerless, useless. All his money, all his influence, meant nothing in this place. All he could do was wait and pray to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. Late the next afternoon, a nurse informed him that Lillian was awake. His heart leaped into his throat. He followed the nurse to the ICU, his steps hesitant. He stopped in the doorway of her room. She looked small and fragile against the stark white sheets, hooked up to a web of monitors that beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Her eyes fluttered open and found his. For a moment, there was just confusion. Then, as memory returned, her expression hardened. Fear, anger, and a deep, soul-crushing weariness washed over her face. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice raspy. He took a tentative step into the room. "Lillian, I found you. I called the ambulance." He was stammering, the confident, commanding CEO completely gone. "I am so sorry. Sorry?" She cut him off, a spark of fire in her eyes. "You're sorry?" A dry, humorless laugh escaped her raw throat. "You destroy my life. You accuse me of trapping you. You abandon me and your child, and now you're sorry." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. "I know," he said, his voice thick with shame. "There's no excuse. I was a monster." "Yes, you were," she said, the simple agreement more damning than any tirade. She turned her head away from him, looking toward the window. "Please leave," she said, her voice flat and final. "I don't want you here." Her rejection was a blade to the heart. But he knew he deserved it. He deserved so much more. He backed out of the room without another word, the beeping of the machines echoing his own frantic, broken heartbeat. He drove back to his condo in a stupor. When he walked in, Maureen was there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of fury. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "Your phone has been off. You missed the gala. You disappeared all night. I find out from a gossip site that you were seen at a hospital. Were you with her?" The venom in her voice, the selfish indignation. It was like a splash of cold water to his face. He looked at her, at the beautiful, ambitious woman he had chosen, and he felt nothing but revulsion. He saw not a partner, but the co-architect of his destruction. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "I was with Lillian. She collapsed. She's in the hospital. She and the baby. They almost died." Maureen's face barely flickered with concern. Her anger quickly morphed into paranoid jealousy. Oh, how convenient. She collapses right when the divorce is about to be finalized. Are you really falling for this, John? The same accusation he had thrown at Lillian. Hearing it from Maureen's lips, aimed at a woman lying in an ICU bed, was monstrous. In that moment, the entire artifice of their relationship crumbled into dust. It wasn't love or passion. It was a transaction, a toxic symbiosis of ambition and ego. "Get out," Jonathan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What?" Maureen stared at him, incredulous. "I said, get out," he repeated, his voice rising with a cold fury he hadn't felt before. It wasn't the anger of a frustrated CEO. It was the roar of a man who had finally seen the depths of his own moral bankruptcy. This was a mistake, all of it. You, me, this hollow life. It's over. Pack your things and go. Their ensuing fight was epic and ugly, filled with recriminations and bitter truths. But Jonathan's resolve was absolute. He had chosen the wrong person, the wrong life, for the wrong reasons. He had to start making things right. And it started with this, ending the lie. When Maureen finally stormed out, slamming the door behind her, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of rock bottom. It was the sound of a space being cleared for something new. Jonathan returned to the hospital the next day, not to see Lillian, but to speak with her doctors. He needed to know what she needed. As he stood in the hallway, a blur of righteous fury accosted him. It was Chloe, Lillian's friend. "You," she hissed, jabbing a finger into his chest. "You have some nerve showing your face here." Jonathan didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He just stood there and took it, his face a portrait of shame. "You're right," he said quietly. "Everything you're thinking is right. I deserve it." His lack of defense seemed to surprise her, momentarily deflating her anger. "What do you want, Jonathan?" "I want to help," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. "I don't want her to see me. I want to make sure she has everything she needs, the best doctors, a private room, anything. And when she gets out, I don't want her to have to worry about money. Ever." He met with the hospital's financial administrator and paid for everything up front. Then he called his lawyer with a new set of instructions. Not to finalize a divorce settlement, but to set up an irrevocable trust fund for Lillian and the child. He structured it so the payments would come through a third-party firm, anonymously. He didn't want her gratitude or her forgiveness. He just wanted her and his child to be safe. It was the first truly selfless thing he had done in years, and though it didn't lessen his guilt, it was a first, tentative step on the long road toward penance. A week later, Lillian was stable enough to be moved from the ICU to a private room, a luxury she hadn't requested and couldn't explain. She knew it had to be Jonathan. When he requested, through a nurse, to speak with her for 5 minutes, she reluctantly agreed. She needed to set boundaries. He entered the room hesitantly, looking thinner, older. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, heavy humility. They didn't talk about their relationship. There wasn't one to talk about. They talked about the baby. "I want to be a father to this child," he said, his voice steady but soft. "If you'll let me." Lillian looked at him, her gaze clear and unwavering. The ordeal had stripped away her naivete, replacing it with a core of steel. "This isn't about what you want anymore, Jonathan. It's about what this baby needs, and what I will allow." The negotiation was tense. She laid out her terms with the precision of a lawyer. He would have no legal custody, not at first. He would have supervised visitation rights. He would not be present at the birth unless she explicitly invited him. All decisions about the baby's health, education, and upbringing would be hers. She would accept the financial support from the anonymous trust. She knew it was him, because she wouldn't let her pride harm her child's future. But it didn't buy him access or forgiveness. He agreed to every single condition without a moment's hesitation. There was no argument, no negotiation from his side. His only request was simple. "What are you going to name her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lillian paused, her hand resting on her stomach. "I was thinking of Hope," she said. His eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, unable to speak. Hope. It was something he had destroyed, and something she had managed to find in the wreckage. The baby, Hope, was born 6 weeks prematurely, small but fierce, and, against all odds, healthy. Lillian's labor was sudden and difficult. In a moment of fear and exhaustion, she had allowed the nurse to call him. Jonathan arrived at the hospital just as the baby was being born. He waited outside the delivery room, hearing that first miraculous cry. A nurse eventually emerged, smiling, and told him he could come in. Lillian was exhausted, but radiant, holding the tiny, swaddled bundle in her arms. She looked at Jonathan, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she nodded toward the baby. "Do you want to hold her?" His hands trembled as he reached for his daughter. He was terrified he would drop her, that he would break something so perfect and fragile. The moment the tiny 7-pound weight of his daughter settled into his arms, his world shifted on its axis. He looked down at her perfect, miniature face, her tuft of dark hair, her tiny fingers curled around his. A sob escaped him, a raw, guttural sound of grief, regret, and overwhelming love. This was real. More real than any business deal, any penthouse, any fleeting passion. This was his daughter, and he had almost lost her before he even knew her. He wept openly, tears of profound sorrow and profound gratitude streaming down his face. Lillian watched him, and for the first time in a long time, the anger in her heart softened, just a little, into something that resembled pity, and perhaps a microscopic seed of grace. The months that followed were a quiet testament to change. Jonathan proved his commitment not with grand gestures or desperate apologies, but with steady, reliable action. He never missed a scheduled visitation. He showed up on time, every time, with diapers, formula, or whatever Lillian had mentioned they needed. He sold Nexus Innovations, a move that shocked the financial world. He explained it away as wanting to pursue smaller, more meaningful ventures. But the truth was simpler. The empire no longer mattered. It was the symbol of the man he used to be, and he was desperate to leave that man behind. He sold the audacious condo and bought a modest, comfortable house in a quiet suburb near Lillian, with a backyard and space for a swing set. He baby-proofed the entire house before Hope could even crawl. He respected every single one of Lillian's boundaries. He never overstayed his welcome. He never pushed for more. He was simply there, a constant, steady presence in his daughter's life. He learned to change a diaper, to warm a bottle, to recognize the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. He discovered the simple, profound joy of his daughter falling asleep on his chest. He was learning, day by day, how to be a father. One Tuesday evening, Jonathan arrived at Lillian's apartment for his scheduled visit. He found the door slightly ajar and could hear Hope crying inconsolably from inside. He let himself in and found Lillian pacing the living room, her face etched with exhaustion, bouncing a wailing Hope in her arms. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice frayed. "She's teething. Nothing is working. She's been like this for hours." Jonathan didn't say a word. He just walked over, put his hands out, and Lillian, without hesitation, handed the baby over. He held Hope against his shoulder, murmuring softly to her, and rocking her with a gentle, steady rhythm he'd perfected over the last few months. Within minutes, her frantic cries subsided into whimpers, and then silence. She was asleep. He gently laid her in her crib. When he returned to the living room, Lillian was slumped on the sofa, her head in her hands. He went into her small kitchen, put the kettle on, and made her a cup of chamomile tea, just the way she used to like it. He placed it on the coffee table in front of her. She looked up, her eyes expressing a gratitude that words couldn't capture. "Thank you," she whispered. He simply nodded and sat in the armchair opposite her. They sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't an awkward silence, or a tense one. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, the kind that can only exist between two people who have been through a war together and survived. It was the first time since the night he'd left that they had simply existed in the same room. Not as adversaries, not as exes, but as two tired parents united by their love for their child. A year later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Jonathan and Lillian stood in a park. Between them, a little girl with a head full of dark curls and her mother's determined eyes took a shaky step, then another, a wide, gummy smile on her face. Hope wobbled from her mother's outstretched hands toward her father's. Jonathan scooped her up, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the sweet scent of her. "You did it!" he cheered, his voice filled with a pure, uncomplicated joy. He looked over at Lillian, who was watching them with a soft smile. The scars of his betrayal were still there, faint lines on the landscape of their lives. They would never fade completely. The romantic love they once shared was a ghost, a memory from another lifetime. But in its place, something new and arguably stronger had grown. It was a partnership, forged in crisis and tempered by forgiveness. It was a deep, abiding respect built on actions, not words. He was no longer the ruthless millionaire, and she was no longer the heartbroken wife. He was a father. She was a mother. They were a family, redefined. As he set Hope down to let her explore a dandelion, his hand brushed Lillian's. It wasn't a romantic touch, but a simple, human connection. A shared acknowledgement of the beautiful, precious thing they had built from the wreckage. Redemption, he finally understood, wasn't about getting back what you had lost. It was about having the grace to build something new. Jonathan and Lillian's story is a powerful reminder that our worst mistakes don't have to define our future. It's a story about the painful, messy, but ultimately beautiful process of earning a second chance. What did you think of Jonathan's path to redemption? Could you forgive him if you were in Lillian's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories about love, loss, and the strength of the human spirit.
The city was a machine, a great humming steel and glass beast that never slept. Its pulse was the relentless honking of taxis, its breath the warm gust from subway grates, and its heart was the stock market ticker that flashed in countless towers. In one of the tallest of these towers, in an office so quiet it seemed to swallow the city's noise whole, sat Scott. He was a man who had learned to speak the language of this machine, a man who commanded boardrooms and made decisions that shifted millions of dollars. To the world he was a billionaire, a force of nature in a tailored suit. But in the profound silence of his office, he was simply a man surrounded by expensive things, all of which felt strangely empty. On this particular Tuesday, a meeting of monumental importance loomed. It was a meeting that could cement his company's dominance and deliver a final, crushing blow to his longest-standing rival, a stubborn man named Mr. Miller. Scott's assistant had laid out the files, his pen was perfectly aligned, but a strange, restless feeling had taken root in his chest. The four walls of his office, usually a sanctuary of control, felt like they were pressing in. Without a word to his stunned staff, he stood up, decided to walk to the meeting venue to clear his head, and stepped out of the chilled air of his building and into the warm, chaotic thrum of the sidewalk. He moved through the crowd like a shark through water, people instinctively parting for the man in the impossibly sharp suit, his face a mask of unreadable concentration. He was mentally rehearsing his arguments, visualizing the defeat in Mr. Miller's eyes, when a splash of color, impossibly bright and out of place, caught the very corner of his vision. He stopped. Pedestrians bumped into him, muttering curses, but he didn't hear them. There, nestled between a stern bank and a sleek jewelry store, was a flower shop. It was a tiny establishment, its window a chaotic, beautiful jungle of greens and reds and yellows. The sign above the door, painted in a whimsical, curling script, read "The Wildflower Nook." And in the middle of all that color was a young woman. She was humming a tune he didn't recognize, her back to him as she stood on her tiptoes to gently place a single brilliant sunflower into a tall ceramic vase. She wore a simple floral print dress, and her hair, the color of rich honey, was tied up in a loose bun with a few strands escaping to curl against her neck. Scott stood frozen, his important meeting forgotten. He watched, mesmerized, as she moved from vase to bucket, her fingers, delicate and sure, tracing the petals of a rose, fluffing the leaves of a fern. She wasn't just arranging flowers, she was having a conversation with them. Her world, through that window, seemed to operate on a different, slower, more beautiful rhythm than his own. A powerful, unfamiliar impulse seized him. It was an impulse not born of strategy or gain, but of a deep, sudden yearning for that sliver of peace he saw in her. Before his logical mind could protest, his feet were carrying him, the electronic chime of the doorbell announcing his intrusion into her world. The air inside was thick and sweet, a perfume of earth and petals that was 1,000 miles away from the sterile, recycled air of his office. The woman turned and Scott felt the breath catch in his throat. Her eyes were the color of warm chocolate, and they held a gentle curiosity, completely devoid of the recognition or fear he was used to seeing in people's eyes. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving a faint smudge of green, and offered a small, shy smile. "Hello," she said, her voice as soft as the rustle of leaves. "Can I help you find something?" Scott, a man who never struggled for words, found himself speechless. He looked around, gesturing vaguely at the vibrant chaos. I need flowers," he managed, the statement feeling profoundly stupid. Her smile widened, a little spark of amusement lighting her eyes. "Well, you've come to the right place. Was it for a special occasion?" He thought of the meeting, of crushing his rival. "No," he said, the truth surprising him. "No occasion. I just saw them from the street." "Those are the best kind of flowers," she said, her tone warm and approving. "The just because kind. I'm Rose, by the way." "Scott," he replied, his own name feeling new on his tongue. For the next 20 minutes, Rose led him on a tour of her small kingdom. She showed him proud, romantic roses, cheerful daisies that looked like tiny suns, and delicate lilies that smelled like heaven. She explained that red carnations meant admiration, that yellow roses stood for friendship, and that sunflowers, her personal favorite, always sought the light. Scott listened, truly listened, not to gather information for a deal, but simply to hear the music of her voice. He watched the way her hands moved, the way her whole face lit up when she talked about the language of flowers. He bought a mixed bouquet, one she put together just for him, a burst of colors and textures he never would have chosen himself. As she handed him the bouquet, their fingers brushed. It was the briefest of contacts, a whisper of skin against skin, but a jolt, warm and electric, passed between them. Rose's cheeks flushed a delicate pink and she looked down, suddenly fascinated by a leaf on the counter. Scott felt his own carefully constructed composure crack. He paid with a simple card, not the black titanium one that usually drew stares, and for a moment he was just a man buying flowers from a pretty girl. "Thank you, Rose," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Enjoy them, Scott," she replied, her gaze meeting his for one last, lingering second. He walked out of the shop, the electronic chime feeling like a bell tolling the end of a dream. The city's noise rushed back in, but it seemed muted now, as if he was hearing it from underwater. He stood on the sidewalk, holding the ridiculous, beautiful bouquet, the scent of roses and earth clinging to his clothes. The file for his meeting felt heavy and cold in his briefcase. For the first time in a very long time, Scott felt something other than ambition. He felt a strange, hollow ache, a longing for the warmth and simplicity of the last half hour. He was halfway to his meeting before he realized he was still holding the flowers, and the thought of leaving them outside the conference room was suddenly unthinkable. He had walked in seeking clarity, and he had walked out with something far more dangerous and wonderful, a distraction named Rose. And he had no idea that the gentle young woman with earth on her hands was the one person in the city he was absolutely, irrevocably forbidden to want. The boardroom that afternoon was a theater of pressure and precision, a world Scott usually commanded with cold, effortless expertise. But today he felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines. The faces of the other executives, sharp and expectant, seemed to blur at the edges. The detailed charts and financial projections projected on the screen might as well have been written in a foreign language. All he could see was the phantom image of sunflowers, and all he could smell was the ghost of rose petals clinging to the wool of his suit. The bouquet he had inexplicably brought with him stood in a water pitcher in the corner of the room, a vibrant, silent rebel against the monochrome gray and steel of the office. Every time his focus wavered, his eyes would drift to those splashes of yellow and pink, and the memory of Rose's shy smile would flood back, warmer and more real than any number on a spreadsheet. Mr. Miller, his rival, was there in spirit, his interests represented by a team of nervous lawyers. Scott found himself watching them, not with his usual competitive hunger, but with a strange, detached curiosity. What was that man like as a father? Was he the kind of man who brought flowers home to his wife and daughter? The thought was so alien, so disconnected from the cutthroat businessman Scott knew, that it created a dissonance in his mind. He ended the meeting not with a decisive victory but with a terse, "We'll reconvene next week," leaving his own team baffled by his uncharacteristic lack of finality. He walked back to his office, the flowers in his hand, the deal unresolved, and his mind 1,000 miles away from mergers and acquisitions. The following Tuesday he found himself standing outside the flower shop again. This time it was not an impulse but a destination. He had crafted a flimsy excuse about his assistant needing a fresh arrangement for the reception desk, but the lie felt transparent even to him. The bell chimed, and the same wave of earthy fragrance washed over him. Rose was kneeling, transplanting a small seedling into a clay pot, her concentration so complete she didn't hear him enter. He watched her for a long moment, the careful way she cradled the roots, the gentle pat she gave the soil once it was settled. When she finally looked up and saw him, her face broke into a smile of genuine, unguarded pleasure that sent a jolt straight to his heart. "Scott, you came back," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, leaving new smudges of rich, dark soil. "The flowers, they were a hit," he said, the lie feeling clumsy. "My assistant insisted we needed more." And so began their secret, unspoken tradition. Every Tuesday, under the pretext of procuring flowers for his office, Scott would visit the wildflower nook. The excuses grew increasingly creative: a partner's birthday he'd supposedly forgotten, a congratulatory gesture for a colleague, a need to brighten up a specific conference room. Rose, for her part, seemed to understand the pretense but never challenged it. She simply welcomed him into her world. Their conversations began with flowers but slowly, tentatively, branched out like climbing ivy. During his third visit, as she showed him the meaning of purple hyacinths, sorrow, she explained softly for apology, he found himself telling her about the immense pressure of a recent deal that had nearly collapsed, the weight of hundreds of jobs on his shoulders. He didn't use business jargon. He spoke of the sleepless nights and the cold fear of failure. She listened, not as a subordinate or a competitor would, but with a quiet empathy that asked for nothing in return. "It must be very lonely," she had said, her words so simple and so devastatingly accurate that he had to look away. On his fifth visit she shared a piece of her own world. She told him how her father, a kind but very strict and traditional man, wanted her to pursue a more serious career. He believed her flower shop was a hobby, not a life. She spoke of her mother, who had passed away years ago, and how she had taught Rose the names of every wildflower in the fields near their old home. "This shop," Rose said, her voice barely a whisper as she touched a petal, "it's my way of keeping her with me. It feels like my only real connection to happiness sometimes." Scott, who was used to relationships built on mutual benefit and social status, was utterly disarmed by her vulnerability. He was a billionaire who could buy entire islands, yet he felt a pang of envy for the simple, profound love that connected this woman to a memory and a small shop full of plants. He began to see the city not as a machine to be mastered, but as a place that contained hidden pockets of pure, unvarnished beauty, and Rose was the most beautiful of them all. The turning point came on a perfect, sunny afternoon. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and a gentle breeze carried the promise of summer. Scott, looking at the weather report that morning, had made a decision that felt both reckless and utterly necessary. He walked into the shop, foregoing his usual pretext. "Rose," he said, his voice more earnest than she had ever heard it. "There's a park. A private one not far from here. It has a garden with, well, I'm told it has very good flowers. Would you like to have a picnic with me there? Just for an hour." Rose's eyes widened. A myriad of emotions flickered across her face: surprise, a flash of fear, a dawning excitement. She glanced around the empty shop as if her father might be hiding behind a rack of potting soil. This was a line they had been dancing around for weeks, and he was asking her to cross it. A secret friendship in the shop was one thing, a deliberate meeting outside of it was another entirely. She bit her lip, her internal struggle plain to see. "Please," Scott added, the word foreign and heartfelt on his lips. "It's just a picnic." The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of a small refrigerator unit. Then, slowly, a shy, radiant smile spread across her face and she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Just a picnic." An hour later, they were sitting on a soft woolen blanket in the dappled shade of an old oak tree. The private park was silent except for the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. Rose had brought a small basket of strawberries from her lunch, and Scott had procured sandwiches and lemonade from a nearby cafe. They talked for over an hour, but the conversation was different now, freed from the confines of the shop. They spoke of childhood dreams, of favorite books, of a shared dislike for loud, crowded parties. Scott found himself laughing, a real, deep laugh that came from his stomach, not a polite social chuckle. He watched Rose, her face turned up to the sun, completely at ease, and he felt a profound sense of rightness, a peace so deep it was almost dizzying. As they packed up to leave, the reality of their separate worlds began to seep back in. Rose's expression grew somber. "My father, he wouldn't understand this," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the distant city skyline, the world of towers where Scott reigned and her father schemed. Scott looked at her, at the worry in her beautiful eyes, and felt a protective surge so fierce it startled him. "He doesn't have to know," Scott said, his voice low and firm. This is just for us." Rose looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw the same conflict he felt, the thrill of the secret warring with the fear of discovery. She simply nodded, and in that silent agreement, their friendship was sealed, transforming into something more delicate, more dangerous, and infinitely more precious. They had built a tiny, secret world for two, a world made of whispered confidences and the silent, growing language of their hearts. The weight of the secret began to shape their lives, carving out a hidden world within the bustling city. For Scott, the endless cycle of meetings and negotiations became a countdown to the moments he could steal with Rose. His office, once a command center, now felt like a waiting room. The sleek titanium of his watch seemed to tick slower, each second a deliberate drag until he could see her again. For Rose, the flower shop was no longer just her sanctuary, it became their meeting point, a stage for a play with an audience of one. Every bouquet she assembled held a silent message for him, a language of flowers he was slowly learning to decipher. Purple hyacinths for his sorrowful past, white daisies for the innocence of their connection, and always, a single sunflower, seeking the light of his presence. Their meetings evolved beyond the shop. They were careful, strategic, moving through the city like ghosts. They met at obscure art galleries in the quiet hours of the morning, where they could speak in hushed tones about the paintings, their conversations a veil for the unspoken feelings shimmering between them. They walked along the less-traveled paths of the riverbank at dusk, the fading light hiding the intimacy in their glances. Scott, who was used to being the most visible man in any room, learned the art of invisibility for her. He wore simple caps and jackets, he drove an unassuming car on these outings, and he discovered a strange thrill in the anonymity, in the act of shedding his billion-dollar identity to become just a man named Scott, walking with a woman named Rose. The tension between them was a living thing, a third presence that walked with them, silent and potent. It was in the way his hand would hover near the small of her back as he guided her through a door, never quite touching but feeling the warmth of her anyway. It was in the way her breath would sometimes catch when he leaned in to point something out, the scent of her shampoo, something simple like chamomile and honey, overwhelming his senses. They talked about everything and nothing, their words building a fortress around their shared secret, but their bodies spoke a different, more urgent language of unfulfilled desire. One evening he took her to a place he had never shown anyone. It was a forgotten conservatory attached to an old, closed museum, a place he owned but kept private. The glass panes were dusty on the outside, but inside, it was a magical, overgrown paradise. Vines snaked up rusted iron pillars, and moonlight filtered through the dirty glass, illuminating exotic plants that had grown wild and free for decades. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. They walked in silence along the cracked stone path, the only sounds their soft footsteps and the distant hum of the city. The atmosphere was charged, the seclusion and the raw beauty of the place stripping away the last of their defenses. Rose seemed both enthralled and nervous, her eyes wide as she took in the untamed jungle around them. She could feel the shift in Scott, a new intensity in his stillness. "Scott," she began, her voice barely a whisper, laced with a tremor of both fear and anticipation. It's so much. Please let's go slow." The words were a plea, an attempt to build a dam against the tidal wave of emotion she felt building between them. But Scott was lost. The careful control he exercised over every other aspect of his life shattered in that moment. The sight of her, bathed in the ethereal moonlight, surrounded by the wild, fragrant beauty he had saved just for her, was too much. Her plea to go slow was a distant echo, drowned out by the roaring in his blood. The billionaire who always calculated his moves lost all control, driven by a need more powerful than any business acquisition. He turned to her, his eyes dark and full of a raw hunger she had never seen. He didn't speak. He simply closed the small distance between them, his hands coming up to cradle her face, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the fierce intensity in his gaze. He gave her a moment, a single heart-stopping second where his eyes asked a silent question, and in her parted lips and wide, trusting eyes, he found his answer. Then he bent his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle first kiss. It was a claiming, a release of weeks of pent-up longing and desire. It was a storm of suppressed passion, fierce and deep, pouring all the loneliness and hunger of his life into that one connection. Rose, for a moment, stiffened in surprise, her hands fluttering to his chest. But then, the warmth of his mouth, the scent of him, clean linen and something uniquely male, overwhelmed her. A small, helpless sound escaped her throat, and she melted into him, her arms sliding up around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair as she kissed him back with a passion that matched his own. The world outside the glass walls ceased to exist. There was only the taste of him, the feel of his strong arms wrapping around her, pulling her flush against his hard body, the frantic beating of her heart against his. It was a kiss that spoke of secrets shared and a future desired, a desperate, spicy and profound intimacy born in a hidden garden. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, they simply held each other in the moonlight, their foreheads resting together. No words were needed. The line had been crossed. Their secret friendship had burst into a forbidden, all-consuming flame, and they both knew there was no going back. The fear of her father's wrath was now a cold, sharp reality waiting in the shadows, but in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, it felt very, very far away. The world outside their hidden conservatory felt different, sharper, and more dangerous. The kiss had changed everything. For Scott and Rose, the city was no longer just a place of secrets, but a landscape of potential discovery. Every ring of Rose's phone made her heart leap into her throat, terrified it was her father. Every glance from a stranger on the street felt like an accusation. Yet, within this new layer of fear bloomed a deeper, more profound intimacy. Their stolen moments were now charged with a desperate physical need. Their conversations in the flower shop were hushed, their hands seeking each other out for brief, electric touches as he paid for his weekly bouquet. Their secret meetings were filled with long, searching kisses in the back of his car, her head cradled in his hands, his body a shield against the world that wanted to pull them apart. It was a desperate, spicy romance conducted in whispers and shadows, each touch a rebellion, each murmured, "I love you," a vow against the tide. The inevitable collision of their two worlds began not with a shout, but with a silence. Mr. Miller, a man as shrewd in his personal life as he was in business, had grown suspicious of his daughter's sudden cheerfulness, her distracted air, the way she would sometimes smile at nothing. He noticed the bouquets she would bring home, far more elaborate than anything she usually kept for herself. A quiet, cold dread settled in his gut. He had a private investigator, a discreet man, follow her for a single afternoon. The evidence was delivered in a plain manila envelope, a series of photographs. His daughter, his Rose, laughing up at Scott, her hand in his. Scott, his most hated rival, pulling her close in a secluded park. The final, damning image of them sharing a passionate, lingering kiss outside the forgotten conservatory. The confrontation that evening was volcanic. Rose had just returned home, the scent of Scott's cologne still a ghost on her skin, a secret smile on her lips. Her father was waiting for her in the living room, the photographs laid out on the coffee table like a hand of accusing cards. His face was a mask of cold, betrayed fury. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. The blood drained from Rose's face. All the joy of the afternoon evaporated, replaced by a chilling fear. "Father, Have you lost your mind?" he interrupted, his voice rising to a thunderous pitch. "That man? Scott. He is a shark. A monster who would ruin me, who would ruin this family without a second thought. He is using you, Rose. Can't you see that? This is just another one of his games, a way to get to me." Tears welled in Rose's eyes, but she stood her ground. "You're wrong. He's not like that. He's kind and he cares for me." "He cares for nothing but winning," her father roared, slamming his hand on the table. "I forbid it. Do you hear me? You will not see him again. Not a single phone call, not a single message. If I find out you have disobeyed me, the shop is closed. Do you understand?" The threat was a knife to her heart. The flower shop was her soul, her last connection to her mother. It was an impossible choice, crafted with the precision of a man who knew exactly where to strike. Meanwhile, in his own world, Scott was facing a different kind of climax. The deal with Miller's company had reached its final, critical point. His team had laid the final offer on the table, a brilliant, aggressive move that would effectively force Miller into a corner, allowing Scott to acquire the company at a fraction of its value. It was the masterstroke he had been working towards for years. He sat at the head of the polished conference table, his executives looking at him with expectant, triumphant faces. The documents were ready for his signature. All he had to do was pick up the pen. But as he looked at the papers, he didn't see a victory. He saw Rose's face, tear-streaked, as she spoke of her father's disappointment. He saw the flower shop, her sacred space. He saw the trust in her warm brown eyes when she looked at him. If he went through with this, he would be confirming every terrible thing Miller believed about him. He would be the monster. He would be choosing his ambition over her heart, and in doing so, he would destroy the only real, beautiful thing that had ever happened to him. The silence in the room stretched, growing heavy and uncomfortable. His chief lawyer cleared his throat. "Scott, the papers?" Scott's gaze was fixed on a single distant point, his mind 1,000 miles away. He saw a future of empty victories and silent, lonely offices. And then he saw a future with Rose, a future of sunlight and simple joys. The choice was suddenly perfectly clear. He pushed his chair back, the sound echoing in the silent room. "The deal is off," he said, his voice calm and final. A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the table. "What? Scott, we can't. This is $1 billion. "I said it's off," Scott repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Pull the offer. All of it." He didn't wait for their protests. He turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving a sea of bewildered faces in his wake. He didn't go to his office. He went straight to his car, a single purpose burning in his chest. He drove directly to Rose's house, to the home of his rival. He didn't call, he didn't strategize. He parked on the quiet, tree-lined street and walked up the path, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rang the bell. Mr. Miller opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to pure, unadulterated hatred. "You," he snarled. "You have some nerve coming here. Get off my property." From the hallway behind him, Scott saw Rose, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her eyes met his, wide with fear and a flicker of hope. Scott stood his ground, his hands open at his sides, a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I came to tell you that I've withdrawn the offer for your company. The deal is dead." Mr. Miller stared, his anger momentarily frozen by confusion. "What kind of trick is this?" "No trick," Scott said, his gaze shifting from Miller to Rose, holding her eyes. "I love your daughter. And I choose her. I choose Rose over any deal, over any company, over any amount of money." He looked back at the older man, his expression raw and honest. "I'm not the man you think I am. Not anymore." The silence on the doorstep was absolute. Mr. Miller looked from Scott's determined face to his daughter's pleading one. He saw the truth in Scott's eyes, a truth that no business rival could ever fake. The relentless billionaire had just sacrificed his greatest professional victory, publicly and without condition, for the sake of his daughter. The foundation of his anger, built on the belief that Scott was only using Rose, crumbled into dust. He took a slow, deep breath, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. He didn't give his blessing, not in words, but he stepped back from the doorway, a silent, monumental concession. The war was over. Scott had surrendered, and in his surrender he had won everything. The air on the doorstep of the Miller home did not instantly become warm and friendly. Mr. Miller's retreat from the doorway was not an embrace, but a cessation of hostilities, a silent, stunned acknowledgement that the world had just been rearranged by a force he did not understand. He turned and walked back into the house without another word, leaving Scott and Rose standing in the twilight, the space between them charged with a new, terrifying freedom. Rose, her tears now flowing for an entirely different reason, took a hesitant step forward, then another, until she was close enough to touch him. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, as if to confirm he was real, that his words had been real. Scott covered her hand with his own, turning his face to kiss her palm, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it sealed the truth of his sacrifice more than any legal document ever could. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rebuilding, not on the shaky ground of secret rendezvous, but on the solid, if newly laid foundation of Scott's choice. The first dinner Scott shared with Rose and her father was a quiet, formal affair, the clink of cutlery echoing in the strained silence. Mr. Miller observed Scott, not as a billionaire titan, but as a man who carefully pulled out his daughter's chair, who listened intently when she spoke, whose eyes softened when they rested on her. It was in these small, unguarded moments that the ice around the older man's heart began to truly thaw. He saw the change in his daughter too, a new confidence, a radiance that came from being loved openly and without reservation. She was no longer his secret-keeping girl, but a woman blooming in the sunlight of a love that had been tested and had proven true. With the shadow of her father's disapproval lifted, Scott and Rose's relationship deepened into a richer, more intimate connection. The frantic, desperate passion of their hidden meetings matured into a slow, burning certainty. They learned each other not in stolen moments, but in the quiet rhythm of everyday life. Scott would cook dinner for her in his vast, previously sterile penthouse, learning her favorite foods, filling the spaces with her laughter. Rose would drag him to farmers' markets on Sunday mornings, teaching him to pick the ripest tomatoes, her hand permanently tucked in the crook of his arm. Their intimacy was no longer just about physical desire, though that flame burned hotter than ever, now fueled by trust and the joy of discovery. It was in the way he would massage her shoulders after a long day at the shop, the way she would quietly bring him a cup of tea when he was working late, the way they would fall asleep tangled together, her head on his chest as if they were two parts of a single whole. Scott, the man who had once commanded empires from a place of solitude, found himself being gently remade by her love. He learned to delegate, to trust his team, to value an afternoon walking with Rose over an afternoon closing a deal. The hard, sharp edges of his ambition were smoothed away, not out of weakness, but because he had found a greater purpose. He started a foundation with Rose, funding community gardens and horticultural therapy programs, using his wealth not as a weapon, but as a tool to cultivate the kind of beauty she saw in the world. He was no longer just a billionaire, he was a man deeply and completely in love. A year to the day after he had stood on her father's doorstep and given up his empire for her, Scott knew it was time. He planned everything with the same meticulous attention to detail he once reserved for corporate takeovers, but this time, his heart was his only advisor. He took Rose back to the very beginning, to the Wildflower Nook. He had arranged with her part-time helper to have the shop closed for a private consultation, a ruse Rose believed completely. The bell chimed as they stepped inside, and the familiar, beloved scent of earth and blossoms wrapped around them. Rose moved through her shop, a happy, contented smile on her face, unaware that Scott had stayed by the door. When she turned to ask him what he thought, she found him not standing but down on one knee. In his hand was not a ring box but a single, perfect key. "Rose," he began, his voice thick with emotion, yet clear and sure in the quiet shop. "This place is where I found my way back to life. It's where I found you. You taught me that the most precious things can't be bought, they have to be grown with patience and care and love." He held up the key. "This is the key to this shop. I bought the building this morning. It's yours. Forever. No one can ever take it from you." He paused, letting the immensity of the gesture sink in, seeing the tears of joy welling in her eyes. Then he reached into his pocket and finally pulled out a simple, elegant diamond ring. "But a building is just a place. It's empty without you in it. Rose, you are my home. Will you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife? Will you build a forever with me?" Rose could not speak. Her hands flew to her mouth, her whole body trembling with a happiness so profound it felt like a new form of gravity. She nodded over and over again before finally finding her voice. "Yes," she cried, her voice echoing in the shop that had witnessed the first chapter of their love story. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as he stood to kiss her, the future unfolded before them, bright and limitless. Their wedding was not a society event, but a celebration in a flower-filled garden, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. Mr. Miller gave her away with a proud, genuine smile, finally seeing the man his son-in-law had become. Scott and Rose built their life together, a beautiful fusion of their two worlds, where boardroom strategies were balanced by the simple wisdom of a sunflower seeking the light. Their love story, which began with a forbidden glance through a shop window, became a testament to the power of sacrifice and the enduring beauty of a love chosen, every single day. Their journey proves that the most extraordinary stories are often found in the most ordinary places, if you only know where to look. If you enjoyed following the story of Scott and Rose and want to find more tales of romance, sacrifice, and forever, please subscribe for more. New stories are waiting to be discovered, each one a new world to explore.